The morning inside the prison didn't begin with voices. It began with doors, one after another, metal sealing metal, each sound cutting off another possible exit. 40 minutes before the first note was supposed to be played, the order came down quietly. Cancel the concert. On paper, it was about security, about risk, about procedure. In reality, it was fear. Fear of songs that didn't shout, didn't incite, but spoke too fluently in a language the inmates already knew by heart. In the corridors, no one stood comfortably. Guards avoided eye contact. Administrators whispered without deciding anything. The building felt paused, like it was holding its breath. Johnny Cash was already inside. He heard the shift in tone. He heard what wasn't being said. This was the moment when the system usually won, by stopping the music before it started. But this time, Cash didn't back away. One calm sentence, spoken without threat or drama, would force the warden to reverse the order, and leave a mark on this prison that reports would never record. The question isn't what Cash said. It's why, this time, he chose not to walk out. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. By 1967, Johnny Cash had already learned what it meant to be searched, questioned, and judged before opening his mouth. He had been arrested more than once, not in dramatic raids, but in dull rooms that smelled of paper and authority. Pills had taken years from him. Alcohol had hollowed out entire tours. There were nights he barely remembered, and mornings he remembered too well. None of that was rumor inside prison walls. Guards knew. Wardens knew. Inmates knew. That was precisely the problem. When Cash sang about cells, about time stretching until it became punishment itself, it didn't sound like performance. It sounded like recognition. Prison administrators understood the difference immediately. They were not afraid of shouting crowds or raised fists. They were afraid of men sitting still, listening too closely. Before Folsom, there were smaller rooms, county facilities, military stockades, places where the audience wasn't briefed on how to react. No applause, no cheers, just rows of men watching him the way animals watch weather, without hope, without surprise. Cash noticed it every time. He would finish a song and hear nothing but breathing. That silence stayed with him longer than any ovation he'd ever had. Administrators watched it too. They saw heads tilt, jaws tighten, shoulders relax in ways training manuals never mentioned. After one show, a deputy warden pulled him aside and said the words plainly, without anger, "You're making them feel seen." The sentence was not meant as praise. Requests followed. Suggestions, they called them. Could he soften certain lines? Change a word here? Skip a verse there? Cash listened, nodded, then refused. He wasn't confrontational about it. He simply said he couldn't sing a song he didn't believe in. And that was that. Someone else used the word romanticizing. Cash didn't argue. He knew better. He wasn't singing about freedom. He was singing about what it cost to lose it. Once, after a set, a correctional officer waited until the hallway cleared and asked for an autograph. His hands shook when he said it. Cash signed the paper on his knee. The next morning, that officer was reassigned without explanation. Cash heard about it weeks later. He didn't comment. He added it to the list of quiet consequences he never wrote down. His record label grew uneasy. Recording inside a prison wasn't risky because of sound quality. It was risky because of meaning. Executives warned him carefully, professionally. This kind of association could stall a career already hanging by a thread. Cash understood them. Some nights, alone, he even agreed. He was tired. His health was unstable. His faith in himself came and went. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered the silence. Not the dangerous kind, the listening kind, the kind that made people in uniform shift their weight. That was why the prisons hesitated. Not because Johnny Cash was loud, because he didn't need to be. The gates closed behind Johnny Cash with a sound that carried weight. Not loud, not sharp, final. The kind of sound that reminded everyone inside that nothing here moved by accident. His guitar case was opened, searched, then searched again. His boots were inspected longer than his paperwork. A guard ran a hand along the seam of his jacket, slower than necessary. Cash didn't react. He had learned that stillness traveled further than protest in places like this. They told him which songs were a problem while walking, not sitting, not formally. No documents, no signatures, just names spoken under breath, like warnings rather than rules. Cash listened without interrupting. He didn't ask questions. He knew the point wasn't the list. The point was control. The warden waited in an office that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. A career man, clean uniform, walls covered with certificates instead of photographs. He spoke about safety first, about responsibility, about how a single incident could reach Washington faster than truth ever did. He didn't mention lyrics. He didn't have to. His eyes did the work. Behind the stage area, the building breathed differently. Cold air slid through narrow corridors. Metal rang when doors shifted. Somewhere far off, men were being seated, one section at a time. No music, no announcements. Just time moving forward whether anyone liked it or not. Then the decision came down. Quiet. Final. The show would be postponed, possibly cancelled. Officially, it was a security concern. Unofficially, it was about what had happened during rehearsal. Men leaning forward, not clapping, not joking, listening too closely again. A guard approached another guard near the loading door. Their voices stayed low. One of them nodded toward the hall and said something that didn't sound threatening, just tired. If Cash didn't sing, today would end worse than it began. Not louder. Worse. No one reported that sentence. But it moved. Some staff agreed with the cancellation and hated it at the same time. Others wanted the show to happen and didn't dare say so. Fear didn't divide them into sides. It flattened them. Cash was told he could still perform, under tighter conditions. Fewer inmates. Select blocks only. He shook his head once. He said he wouldn't play to a room chosen for him. Either everyone who'd been brought here stayed, or he didn't step out at all. The warden didn't answer immediately. He looked past Cash, toward the hallway, as if listening for something that hadn't happened yet. Time thickened. The building waited. And for the first time that day, no one was certain who was holding whom in place. They stood in a narrow office that had never been meant for conversations like this. One desk, two chairs, a clock that ticked too loudly because nothing else was allowed to make noise. The door closed without ceremony. No guards inside. No witnesses. Just Johnny Cash, and the man whose signature could end the day before it began. The warden spoke first, but only to repeat what had already been said. Protocol. Risk assessment. The word liability appeared twice. Cash listened without leaning back, without crossing his arms. When the warden finished, there was an opening, an empty space where argument usually rushed in. Cash didn't fill it right away. He looked tired, not defeated. His face showed the marks of years that hadn't been kind, but his eyes were steady. When he finally spoke, his voice stayed low. No edge, no appeal. He said one sentence, not about music, not about rules, not about rebellion. He said that if he walked out now, without singing, the men waiting out there would stop believing that anyone on the outside could hear them at all. And once that belief was gone, No amount of order would replace it. He stopped. He didn't explain himself. He didn't add weight to the words. He let them sit between them, unfinished. The clock kept ticking. From somewhere beyond the walls came a sound. Not shouting, not chanting, just movement. Benches shifting, shoes against concrete, a low murmur that never rose into chaos. The warden noticed it too. His eyes moved toward the door, then back to Cash. He said nothing. When he did respond, it wasn't agreement. It was negotiation. The performance could happen. Barely. Under conditions that stripped it of dignity. No introductions, no comments between songs, no deviation from the approved order, immediate termination at the first sign of trouble. Cash would be escorted in and out like cargo. It wasn't framed as punishment. It didn't need to be. Cash nodded once. He accepted everything without pushing back. The way he agreed made it feel like surrender. Like the system had won by simply waiting him out. The warden reached for the phone to relay the decision. His hand paused for a fraction of a second before lifting the receiver. He didn't look relieved. He looked older. Cash stood. He adjusted his jacket. For a moment, it seemed like the weight of what he'd just agreed to settled fully on him. Not fear. Something closer to responsibility. As he reached the door, the warden spoke again, softer this time. He said he hoped Cash understood what he was walking into. Cash didn't turn around. He said he already did. Outside, the hallway felt longer than before. The sound of waiting pressed in from every direction. Whatever this was about to become, it was already beyond paperwork. The decision had been made, and it hadn't solved anything yet. Johnny Cash walked out without introduction. No name, no greeting, no glance toward the officials who had arranged themselves along the wall instead of taking seats. He stepped into the light as if it were a task, not a moment. The guitar settled against him with practiced weight. He didn't test the microphone. He didn't smile. The first song came out rough and stripped down. No softness, no promise of redemption tucked into the melody. It spoke of long nights and longer consequences, of days that stacked on top of each other until they stopped meaning anything. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. It always did. What followed wasn't applause. It wasn't approval. It was a low, spreading awareness that moved through the room and then vanished. Men stopped shifting. Someone coughed, and then didn't again. The noise drained away until the only thing left was attention. From the side, the warden stayed on his feet. He had chosen a position near the exit, as if reminding himself this was still temporary. His hands stayed visible. The guards nearest the stage rested their palms close to their radios, fingers hovering where protocol said they should be. No one relaxed. Cash finished the song and didn't move right away. He let the last note fall and waited longer than expected. Too long. He looked out across the rows, not scanning, not searching, just meeting the room head-on. It wasn't defiance. It was acknowledgement. That pause broke the agreement more cleanly than any lyric could have. Nothing happened. No shouting, no surge forward, no sudden laughter to release tension. The men stayed where they were, still, watching. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt held, like a breath no one wanted to release first. One of the guards removed his cap, not dramatically, just enough to wipe his forehead. He didn't realize what he'd done until another guard noticed and then looked away. It was a small breach. It mattered anyway. Cash began the next song without explanation. The tempo stayed controlled. He didn't lean into emotion. He didn't pull back either. His voice carried strain, and he didn't hide it. That made the words land heavier, not lighter. The warden felt it then, The shift he hadn't been trained to recognize. Control hadn't been lost. It had become irrelevant. If he stopped the performance now, the interruption itself would echo louder than anything being sung. The room wasn't calm because of authority. It was calm because it had been given something to focus on. Cash knew it too. His shoulders stayed tight. He didn't look comfortable. This wasn't triumph. It was risk managed 1 second at a time. For the first time that day, the system hesitated, not out of mercy, but out of uncertainty. And the music kept going. Cash stopped after the song ended, but this time the pause wasn't gentle. It landed heavy, deliberate. He shifted his weight and lifted his eyes past the front rows, toward the line of uniforms along the wall. For a brief moment, it looked like he was waiting for someone else to move first. No one did. He glanced once toward the warden. Not a challenge. More like a check, confirming that the boundary was still there, that crossing it would be noticed. Then he looked back to the room and began to play again without naming what was coming. The opening chords were familiar to a few people who shouldn't have recognized them. A song that had been discussed, flagged, quietly discouraged. Not because it encouraged escape or violence, but because it refused to soften what time did to a man once it was taken from him. No slogans, no blame. Just the slow erosion of days that never returned. The tempo stayed restrained. Cash didn't rush it. He let the words arrive exactly when they were meant to, leaving space between lines that felt almost uncomfortable. The song didn't accuse anyone directly. That made it harder to deflect. A short laugh broke out somewhere in the middle rows, sharp, nervous, cut off almost immediately. A few men dropped their gaze to the floor. Others stared straight ahead, unmoving. Near the back, a voice joined quietly, barely above breath. Then another, not enough to become a chorus, enough to be noticed. That was when the warden leaned toward a guard and spoke without turning his head. The order was clear. Be ready to end it. Not yet, but soon. The phrase hung unfinished, like the music itself. Cash saw the movement. He understood exactly what it meant. His hands didn't change pace. His voice didn't harden or plead. He stayed steady, almost stubbornly so, as if accelerating would give someone permission to step in. The room felt different now. Not louder. Heavier. The realization settled slowly that whatever was happening couldn't be undone by flipping a switch or escorting a man off a stage, even if the recording disappeared, even if no one spoke about it afterward. The memory would remain intact. This wasn't a performance anymore. It wasn't even defiance. It was exposure. The final lines landed without emphasis. Cash let them fall where they stood. When the song ended, he didn't fill the silence. He let it stretch, long enough to make intervention feel clumsy. The warden knew then that stopping the show wouldn't restore control. It would only underline that something irreversible had already taken place. There was no retreat left, only conclusion. The final stretch didn't announce itself. There was no shift in lighting, no cue that the end was near. Cash simply moved forward as if time had narrowed and there was nothing left to circle around. The remaining songs slowed further, each one landing with less decoration than the last. He didn't reach for anything that might lift the room. He let gravity do its work. There was no goodbye between songs, no nod to the audience, no acknowledgement of where he was standing. His voice carried wear, not strain, and the restraint in it mattered more than volume ever could. Every note felt placed, not performed. When he spoke, it wasn't framed as a message. It didn't sound like a statement meant to be remembered. He didn't address the men seated in front of him at all. He turned slightly, just enough to include the line of guards and the warden near the wall, and said a single sentence about what responsibility looked like after the music stopped. Not blame, not warning. Just a reminder that what followed mattered more than what had just happened. Then he picked the guitar back up and finished. There was no release, no applause breaking the tension. The room stayed quiet in a way that felt intentional. One by one, the men stood. Not rushed. Not prompted. The movement spread evenly, like a decision made without discussion. They filed out in near silence, their steps measured, their eyes forward. Something unusual happened then. The guards didn't bark instructions. They didn't tighten formation. They watched and adjusted instead of commanding. For a few seconds that stretched longer than expected. No one seemed sure who should speak first. The warden hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it. By the time he gestured for the usual procedures to resume, the moment had already passed. The process restarted, but it felt delayed, slightly out of sync. Cash remained where he was until the room emptied. He didn't soak anything in. He didn't look relieved. He looked focused, as if keeping himself steady required attention. When an escort approached, he nodded and followed without comment. Backstage, no one congratulated him. No one criticized him either. The building settled back into routine, but it did so imperfectly, like machinery restarting after a brief stall. The music was over. What lingered was the silence it had rearranged. What followed never unfolded the way scandals usually did. There were no headlines about disorder, no public hearings, no footage replayed until meaning wore thin. Inside the prison, reports were filed that said almost nothing. Language stayed neutral. No mention of tension, no reference to silence, just routine phrasing that suggested the day had passed as expected. It hadn't. Within weeks, an internal review circulated. Quiet questions, polite interviews, nothing that pointed blame. The warden wasn't dismissed. That would have drawn attention. He was reassigned instead, moved laterally to a position that sounded important and felt smaller. Officially, it was a step forward. Everyone understood it wasn't. Inside the facility, something subtle shifted. Not policy, not discipline, tempo. The noise level dropped. Fewer incidents late in the day. Less shouting from behind closed doors. Guards noticed before anyone else did. They didn't talk about the concert. They talked about how evenings seemed to move differently now, as if something had settled and stayed put. Outside, the recording escaped containment. Copies passed hand to hand before anyone decided how to frame them. Critics didn't argue about fidelity or song selection. They talked about presence, about how it felt less like an album, and more like being placed somewhere you couldn't leave. Some called it uncomfortable. Others called it honest. Both were correct. Johnny Cash didn't promote it the way he might have before. He didn't explain himself. When asked, he answered briefly or not at all. The fear around his name didn't fade. It changed shape. It became public, discussed, even respected. People stopped worrying about what he might do on stage. They worried about what would happen after. Months later, a letter arrived without ceremony. No return address. The handwriting was careful, restrained. It didn't thank him. It didn't confess anything. It said only that after that day, the place had grown quieter, that men seemed less eager to prove something to the walls. That sleep came easier for a while. Cash folded the letter and put it away. He didn't keep it close. He didn't reread it often. He understood what it meant without needing to hold on to it. He never tried to recreate that moment, never chased it. He knew it hadn't worked because of preparation or courage or intent. It had worked because he hadn't played a role, because he'd said one sentence when it mattered and then let everything else follow without interference. The story didn't end in triumph. There was no lasting victory to claim, just a brief failure of certainty in a system built on it. And for those who witnessed it, on either side of the line, that was enough.